Hi, welcome back to another video. This week I spoke about, last week I spoke about how Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition was basically terribly laid out. And I stand by that. It's a classic game, but it's not very well laid out and just presented. Well, I was going to do a side-by-side of that and Second Edition, which is my beginning edition, which I started with. Well, that or BECME, I can't remember. It's shade. I can't remember if I started with BECME or Advanced Second Edition, but I played both in my teens, to be quite honest. So a bit of both. Anyway, I just wanted to show you just a comparison and why I believe Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition is the best old edition game out there for being understandable. Well, that and BECME, but it is just, to me, it's just so much better laid out. And what do I mean? Well, let's have a look at this first edition player's handbook. It basically, I'm looking at page 8 here. It says creating the character. And I can't actually see. It doesn't even tell you to roll 3d6. Hang on. Obviously, this is off the cuff. I'm looking at it as I'm doing the video. I don't think it even tells you to roll 3 or 4 dice 6. I think that information's in the Dungeon Master Guide. So the first edition player's handbook, it seemed to keep things from you, which is what Gary Gygax wanted. He's like, oh, the Dungeon Master must know certain things and the players can't know certain things about the game. And this is really much reflected in this book. The first part of the book has the races and the characters you can be, and the font's tiny. It's quite hard reading, isn't it? It's tiny font. And it has little bits of information, but it doesn't have everything you need, which I found very bizarre because this book came out, I believe, before the Dungeon Master's Guide. Monster Manual came out first, was on its own for a year or so. Then Player's Handbook comes out, but then the information you really need to be able to run the game is in the Dungeon Master Guide, which doesn't come out till later. I think obviously people were coming from basic D&D to the newer D&D, and DMs knew how to roll, 3d6 down the line, 4d6 drop below, whatever you want to do, but they knew it at the time. But to me, if you look at it from a point of view of someone who was came into it from second edition, this seems like really strange. So anyway, as I go through it, most of it spells as is wanted in a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons books. All brilliant magic mouth picture at the back, tells you about playing the game and just to get yourself, into it. But this book, it's all right. By the way, my one is printed in the UK, which is why it's soft cover, and by Games Workshop. So my other DM guide, Advanced, is printed in the USA, so it's a good old-fashioned hardcover. Anyway, if we look at the second edition player's handbook, have a look at this. It is so much better laid out. It is the required materials. It tells you, it has an example of a glossary, of what everything means at the front. It has a section on rolling ability scores, different methods for rolling ability scores, because that was allowed back in the day, what all the strength means and everything like that. The other one had what strength means in Constitution, so let's not pretend it didn't have that. But it's laid out in so much nicer tables. Look at these tables. Look how they look. Look at the contrast between the book I showed you before. And there are more illustrations in this book. And it just feels more, to me, this is Dungeons and Dragons to me. I love and respect the old Dungeons and Dragons. I love the artwork of old D&D. But I suppose there's your first edition, isn't there? Like with Doctor Who, if you like Doctor Who, there's your Doctor. Well, for me, this is when I think of D&D, I think of this artwork. This artwork screams out to me as D&D. Oh, this picture's wonderful. Anyway, so look at how well laid out it is. And it has, I don't think anyone in the world can argue that this book is not much better laid out than first edition Dungeons and Dragons. And also, I would say there's a reason why the OSR movement resurrected older games and made them simpler, like OSRIC for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, for example. So much more easy to understand, even though it might be a bit complicated, it's still much more easy to understand than OSRIC. That has barely happened in second edition. I think Golden Glory has been a reprint of it, and that's not really needed because this book is so well laid out. And I think somebody said Hackmaster might harken a bit to it. I don't think it does, to be quite honest. Anyway, so look at how well... So I think there's a reason that this isn't... Second edition isn't really remade a lot in the OSR movement. I think there's a reason. It's perfectly well put together for a old school style game. Look at it. It's brilliant. It brings in proficiencies, weapon specializations and everything. It tells you how to use them really well. Again, it's got the equipment section. It's got a massive proportion of it is then just spells, to be quite honest. But that's brilliant. That's a lovely part of it. But it's absolutely chock-a-block with lovely artwork as well. And we looked at the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide last week when I did the video, so look at that one if you want to have a look at me criticise that, because it's not very well laid out and it's very up and down. Well, if we go through the Dungeon Master's Guide for the second edition, it's so much more better laid out, and it talks to you about different ways to run the game in a so much easier to understand way than what Gary Gygax was. And I know there's a reverence for Gary. Of course there should be. He helped curate the game. Wouldn't be where we are. I wouldn't be talking to you about it without him. But this goes through advantages and disadvantages of all the different methods and how they might affect the game, and wishes and ability scores and character background. And it mirrors the first edition. It mirrors the second edition Player's Handbook with chapter on chapter. So you can look at the chapter you're on and it'll be the same chapter in the Player's Handbook. So say, for example, second chapter is classes, second chapter is classes in the Dungeon Master's Guide and in the Player's. So you can mirror and you can look for specific advice. Somebody said in another video that that's the same for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but it's a lot more... Again, the haphazardness being laid out. Anyway, so looking at this book, it's absolutely brilliant. It's not huge, unlike the other Dungeon Master's Guide, first edition, which pretty much told you how to play the game more. That had all the rules in it. This one is where we start getting all the rules in the Player's Handbook instead, and the Dungeon Master's Guide is the advice, and it's been that way ever since. So second edition started that more. And this just gives some brilliant advice and optional rules for running a campaign. And also what it does talk about is that it says about proficiency. So this is where the start of, you could say, skills are coming in. For all classes, non-weapon proficiency. So people can have a proficiency and they can spend points to get a proficiency. And once they get the proficiency, they can roll under their ability score, or that can even add to their ability score for a particular role. So say your ability score is 16 dexterity and you've spent a couple of points or 1 point in non-weapon proficiency for, I don't know, balancing or something like that, something acrobatic-y or something like that. Well, then if you spent 1 point, then for any acrobatics roll, your dexterity is effectively 17 and you need to roll 17 or under. You probably already know that if you've played Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But so this is where skills start to creep in. Some people don't like that with the OSR movement because, as I've spoken about before and alluded to, you can do what you want. And the game does actually critique itself for that. It says actually it can really open up role-playing possibilities for some people, but for other people it can be a crux to their game because they feel and it even recognizes it this early on. It recognizes that skills in a game can be a crux. They can be liberating and be brilliant tools for the players, but it can be an absolute massive crux to them, and it can ruin the game. Well, not ruin the game might be a bit hard, but it can make the game a bit rough for some people. So it lets you decide. They're optional in it. It lets you decide if you want to use them or do you just want to go with whatever method you've been using before. And I think that's brilliant. And I think Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition is the best laid out version of Dungeons & Dragons. The best laid out. I mean, obviously there's only Advanced and 2nd that go by those more OSR style rules. But obviously, I think it's so much better laid out. It's easier to understand. I got into it much easier. And as I've alluded to, I don't think I'd ever picked up Advanced Dungeons and Dragons very well back in the day. Maybe I would have if I'd have gone from basic and then moved on to advanced. But yeah, I don't think I'd have picked up very well by myself. Anyway, that's my video. So this video is about, if you did want to try old Dungeons and Dragons, try the second edition. It's so much easier. And I think that, like I said, there's a reason I don't think it's been remade in the OSR. It doesn't need to be. It's brilliant. That's my biased opinion. I hope you enjoyed it. Obviously, again, no shade on Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I've run little games of OSRIC with it and things like that. Brilliant game, lovely game. But Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, it's my cup of tea. Anyway, take care, catch you later, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.